Fine, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a tradition of on Fridays getting together and having questions where you can ask any question and we talk about it and find answers to it. And so we're gonna do that, continue that online while we're sheltering in place. And we'll just plan on doing that every Friday at 7. And so if you have a chance to join us, this is a great place or a great time to get together and just talk about any questions that you might have about the Bible, about spiritual things, about philosophy, God, anything at all. And we will see if we can find answers together. And if we can't, then we have stuff to research and come back and talk about next time. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the first question that we received. And it's kind of a doozy. Let's see. Why is it doing that? Well, we'll figure it out maybe as we go. So here's our question. And the question is, who are the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6? That's a good question. So kids, who do you think? Who are the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6?
What is a Nephilim?
I see Stephen.
That's the question.
Stephen abandoned his post.
Sure
He's like, Nephilim, I'm out of here. So that's a good question. What are the Nephilim? So in Genesis chapter 6, we'll just read where it says. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive." They're very pretty. "And they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." So there's kind of your answer, Zane. The Nephilim are the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown.
Which means?
Big people. I mean, that's one thing it means. Like the word Nephilim itself means like monster.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like giant, huge. Okay. Like if you kind of think of the Incredible Hulk, that would be maybe the word that you use to describe who Nephilim is. Yeah. So that's one possible meaning, one probable meaning is it's the mighty ones. It shows up over in Numbers chapter 13 also. The Israelites have come to the promised land and they go in, and when they're giving the report of what they saw, the report of the spies, not the bad advice, that's an important distinction. If you're familiar with the story, that's an important distinction. If you're not familiar, what has happened is God has carried Israel out of Egypt. He split the Red Sea in half, brought them across. They met at the mountain. He gives them the law. And then he brings them to the land of promise that he promised to Abraham. And he brings them to the land of promise. And they send out spies. And they're going to send out 12 spies, one for each of the tribes, excluding the Levites, because there's technically 13. But anyway, so they send one out, one person out from each tribe, and they go and they spy the land out. And when they come back, they give a report. The report isn't bad or good. The report is just a report. Mm-hmm. This is what happened. And they say that we saw huge walled cities. The people there were big. Let's just read the report. In Numbers chapter 13, starting in verse 27, they said, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit." They had carried back a cluster of grapes that were as big as a man. "However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell in the sea along the Jordan. Caleb said, 'Let us go at once and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it.' And the people who had gone up with him," and this is the bad part, "we are not able to go against the people, for they are stronger than we are." So they brought the people of Israel a bad report. And what it means when it says that is, I know earlier I said the report isn't bad. when they're giving the information and they say there's huge walled cities, there's giant people, notice how Caleb responds. Caleb says, let's go take everything over. And then there's 10 besides Joshua. So Caleb and Joshua say, we can go do this. And then the other 10 say, no, we can't go do this. That's the bad part. The bad part is where they say, all those things are true. There's no way we can win. Now, taking the same information, Joshua and Caleb said, yep, all that's true, but we'll win because God is better. And so that's the distinction. And faithful people will respond like Caleb and Joshua, or we ought to respond like Caleb and Joshua, and other people will, when we lack faith, we will respond like those 10. God's not strong enough. This isn't going to work out. Well, the explanation there is down at the bottom. It says, and we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers to them. So they're giants. They're just big people. And the term giant is relative.
Okay.
Yeah. If you're 7'5", it would take a really tall person to be a giant. If you're 7 feet,
right.
5 inches. Yeah. Like Yao Ming, he probably doesn't call too many people giant. What were you going to say?
I was just thinking how tall the people were average at that time. You know, maybe they were like 5 foot. I don't know. So maybe
I know off the top of my head, if I think I'm remembering correctly, I think the average height for a man during like the medieval era was like 5'6". So much shorter than the average height today.
But still, it'd be someone who's considerably taller than them.
Yeah, and this is where and this is where you get into interesting variations in the Old Testament text. The Hebrew, the Masoretic text, gives you a height for Goliath of close to 10 feet tall. And the Septuagint, if I'm not getting these backwards, the Septuagint gives you a height for Goliath of 6 foot something. So it depends, right? You know, but if you're 5'2" and somebody else is 6'8", that they're a giant.
Yeah.
They're still a giant. There are people who are only 6 or 7 inches taller than me, and when they walk into a room, I still think, wow, that guy's tall. Right? So it's relative.
Yeah.
It could be relative. It could be that Goliath is 10 feet tall. It could be that he's just a really big guy. You know, maybe even by today's standards, he would be pretty tall, like Yao Ming or Shaquille O'Neal or one of those types of people. Manute Bol. You know, just these really tall people. They're all basketball players. That's weird. It's actually not. And so, you know, that's what you're dealing with there, is these people who were super tall. Relatively speaking, they're just giants. And so usually when people ask about the Nephilim, really it's kind of, they're asking about those sons of God. Even if they don't realize maybe that's what they're asking about. In fact, I think the person who asked that question about the Nephilim, I think they really wanted to know about the sons of God. Like, the question seems to be like, were they half angels and half person? And maybe that's why they were big. So let's go back to the text in Genesis 6. Kids, you tracking down there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Everything makes sense so far?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you to everybody who is watching. And Tabitha, I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't know, maybe I've never known if height is a recessive gene or not. Do you know?
No, I don't know.
All I know is that my father was the shortest of his brothers, and my mother was the shortest of her siblings, and they both have tall genes in their family, but they got married, and I came. Thanks a lot, parents. Why weren't you tall?
You're tall.
No, yeah. I'm just kidding. I'm very grateful for both of my parents. I don't know. That'll be something interesting to look up. If you have access to a computer right now or the internet, that's a silly thing because she made a comment. Tabitha, if you can look that up and let us know, that'd be interesting. Because it does show up again. The fact that the Nephilim are mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 and Numbers chapter 13 is very significant. Because what happens in between those two places? Stephen Thomas? A huge world-altering event.
The flood.
Yes. Who dies in the flood?
Separate people.
What?
Everybody.
Everybody dies in the flood. Except for who doesn't die?
His family.
And his sons.
Yeah, Noah and his family. Were any of Noah's children Nephilim?
I don't know.
Doesn't say.
It doesn't say, right? Well, when we get to Numbers, the Nephilim are not the children of Israel, right? The Nephilim are removed from the children of Israel. They're the sons of Anak. They have nothing to do with Israel. So if the Nephilim are not in the lineage of Israel, down through Noah, which is where that lineage is going to go, and the Nephilim were there before the flood, and everybody except for Noah and his family die, then could there be Nephilim after the flood if we're talking about a lineage? What do you think?
If Noah's related,
But he's not,
oh, then no.
right? At least according to Numbers chapter 13, they're not. So no, they would not be related. Right? So now, how do you get Nephilim in Numbers chapter 13 if all of them are killed in the flood in Genesis chapter 6?
I guess there would have to be
No idea.
recessive gene for it.
It could just be that the word Nephilim just means huge.
Unusually tall.
Yeah, just really tall. And so anytime somebody was really tall, they would be a Nephilim.
So like a bunch of people that were related being really tall.
Yeah,
That'd be the Nephilim.
yeah. Like, well, I mean, we know people. I won't say their names. I don't want to embarrass them. But we know people that the kids are like, wow, he's a giant. Really, he's not. He's a human. But he's just a really tall human. And when you're a kid, everybody's tall.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so there's this sense of it just means tall person. So tall stature, they say tall stature is a recessive gene. Julianne found that for us. Thank you, Julie. So it is a recessive gene.
Hi, Julianne.
So if we know that we're talking about something that could be transmitted genetically, then it isn't necessarily just a lineage, right? So we're not talking about a particular family. If we have all the Nephilim that are wiped out in the flood, all the giant people are wiped out in the flood, and then later you have more tall people show up,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like the tall people secretly had a baby somewhere who floated around in the flood, and then, oh, now he started a whole other tall nation, right? Or a Nephilim nation. And so the fact that they show up again later makes me think that there's not anything in particularly special about them in Genesis chapter 6 other than what that word would be describing. They're big. And you have other big people later. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, that could be totally off, but that just seems to be what is going on. And if you happen to be able to, if you can see the comments on the video, Harvey Briggs put a link to the Nephilim. I haven't had a chance to check that out yet, but if Harvey posted it, I'm sure it's good. And so right there, I think that's a clue to what's going on in Genesis chapter 6. What are some explanations for Genesis chapter 6 that you guys have heard of or that you have thought up yourself? What could be going on in Genesis chapter 6?
I've heard they were angels before.
The sons of God?
I would say sons of God would be believers, and daughters of man maybe unbelievers. I don't know.
It could be. Yep, some people have suggested that the sons of man refers to those who are faithful to the Lord.
Sons of God, you mean?
Yeah, sons of God are faithful to those who are faithful to the Lord. And then the daughters of man is a diminutive, focusing on, they're not
Man's ways.
Yeah, following man's ways. And it's interesting when you look at this section, right? The first, 8 verses in Genesis chapter 6, and how many times the word man shows up. It shows up a bunch of times. It shows up 8 times in those first 8 verses. So those first 8 verses, they're all about people. They're all about men, mankind. And God is in there once, if I remember right, just where it says sons of God. Oh, it's twice. But in both times, it's in the phrase, the sons of God. And it's just absolutely focused on people. Genesis 5 is also focused on people. This person was the son of this person, and they had kids, and they died, and they died, and they died, and they died. And so there's this focus on death. And then in the beginning of chapter 6, there's again now a focus on people. So Genesis 5 focuses on people and death. Genesis chapter 6 focuses on people, and
You want me to complete
I want you to finish it. Yeah, read my
Life.
mind. Death.
Life.
Death.
Death.
Death. Yeah, because God says, I'm going to kill them all.
Mm.
Right? So, I mean, it's all about people, and the end result of the way of mankind is death. There is a way which seems right to a man, but the end thereof is death. Right? So I think that's what you're seeing here. You have these people who are, they're just dying right and left in the genealogy. Couldn't think of the word. And then you get to Genesis chapter 6, and God says, well, now they're all going to die. And this is where you have this focus on the sons of the daughters of men and the sons of God. The other explanation, who said it? Who said angels? Zane. That's the other explanation, is that these are angels, the sons of God. Where do you think that comes from? Are you familiar with that phrase, guys? Where else does that show up?
Ezekiel, God says that he doesn't just say, hey, you. He says, son of man.
Well, yeah, son of man, right? He refers to Ezekiel as the son of man.
Trisha said, aren't we all sons of God?
No, some of you are daughters. Sorry, that was a dad joke. Yes, there is a sense in which everybody, and you see that in Luke's genealogy. He goes, he names all the people, and then he gets, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a sense, yes, in which we are all mankind. If you go, we're made in the image of God. Both male and female, he made them. In the image of God, he made them. That's right. That's absolutely right. So son of man is in Ezekiel. Good call there, Zane. Any other places that you can think of where maybe the sons of God is used? Job. Job. Good, Stephen. Good. Yes, Job. Right. So who are called the sons of God in Job? Look over in Job chapter 1. Who's called the sons of God?
Job chapter 1.
Yep.
Shoot the Bible right here.
Job chapter 1 and verse 6.
The sons of God.
There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come?
Oh, so that sounds like angels, doesn't it?
So it certainly sounds like angelic or spiritual beings there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when we see that. And so it's used, I think, Trisha gave us a good example. It's used to refer to people. It's also used to refer to these angelic beings, right? The phrase is also used in Deuteronomy chapter 32 to refer to the people of Israel. The sons of God, the children of Israel, are numbered. And so there's a sense in which it's used both ways. So the question would be then, what is it that gives the phrase its meaning? If it's used to refer to people and it's used to refer to angels, then the nature of the being referenced isn't really what's in question, if it can be either one. So really then, what could it be referring to? What would make a distinction when you go back? Let me ask this a different way. When you go back to Job chapter 1, and it says, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Why single him out?
Yeah, I would say it's ones who are on God's side.
Yeah, I agree.
Because Satan is contrasted there. And if it could be spiritual beings and it can be physical people, then I would still say it's those who are on the side of the Lord, following God, right, or servants of God.
Yeah, and when you have physical Israel referenced that the sons of God are being numbered, well, that's supposed to be God's people.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that seems to be the indicator that the sons of God, or anyone of God, is on God's team, maybe to use a more modern expression or phrase. And so there's this idea in which we're on the Lord's side. who is on the Lord's side? Moses will call that out,
Yeah.
and Levi answers. So there's this sense in which maybe that's what it's referring to. In Genesis chapter 6, there were some people who were still following the Lord, and there were people who were not. And in this case, you have the daughters of men and the sons of God being drug away, pulled away from God to follow after the ways of men. I don't think that you should read into it that people have tried to read into that it did. Look at that. Did I get too close to the camera?
You did.
That's not fixing it. Doubt y'all really want to see me this close. Hey. Let's see if it stays focused now.
Pausing for a
Oh, there you go.
There we go.
pausing for a
I'm gonna get it arrested.
comic relief.
Yeah, that's right. What was I saying?
I don't know.
It was really important. Had all the answers. Oh. Some people have abused this passage to say that, look, women are evil
Oh,
because the sons of God were doing good things, and then the daughters of men came, and women are bad.
Wow.
I don't think you can do that. I don't think that's at all what is. All right, that's not the point.
it's not funny, Stephen,
I mean, it is a little, but
but not really.
not really. Tim Matheny said, couldn't this be analogous to the term children of God? Yeah, I think it could. Now, I will admit, I freely admit, that my understanding is that the ancient Hebrew people did not agree with me. Right, with what we just said, the ancient Hebrew people did not agree with that. My understanding is that they believed that to be referring to angels. And they believed that angels came down and had children with women, and that was the Nephilim. But again, my question is, how come there are Nephilim after the flood? If the flood came and wiped out everybody except for Noah and his family, how come the Nephilim show up again?
Mm-hmm.
That would mean that angels had to come back down and do all of that all over again. But they're not called sons of angels.
And isn't there a verse that talks about, I mean, Jesus says that we'll be like the angels, neither married or given in marriage. So
He doesn't say they don't have kids. He just says they don't get married.
Okay.
So, I mean, so that's...
Because I thought they didn't have angel babies.
Well, see, that's where you're wrong. No, I don't know. I think that's kind of his point, is that they're not like people.
Yeah.
Works
differently.
Yeah, it's different. It's a different type of thing. But, I mean, to be fair, my understanding is that the ancient Hebrew people, they all took that, it's the angels answer. That was their understanding. I won't say all, but many. And many early Christians, like when you go back and you read like people from the 100s, 200s, 300s, many of them also believed that it was referring to angels coming down too. And so if you're going to disagree with that, and I kind of do, if you're going to disagree with that, then you have to have a really good reason. You can't just say, well, I really don't want it to be angels because that's creepy. You have to have a reason why you don't think it's the angels. And in my mind, when I'm looking through it, I see the term sons of God or children of God used both ways. It can refer to angels. It can refer to people. And so it doesn't seem to be the nature of the person that's in question.
Right.
It seems to be their relationship to God that's in question. And the Nephilim show up before the flood and after the flood. And so it doesn't seem to be any special parentage that brings about the Nephilim.
Right.
It just seems to be that, man, those guys are super tall. That seems to be the idea. And so that's kind of how I would answer it. I would just see that they're just tall people. Yeah.
Makes sense.
So the question is, so why the differentiation, Lindsay Mast is asking, why the differentiation between the sons of God and the daughters of man?
I think it would kind of, like when we were saying a little while ago, I think that, maybe between the difference between sons and daughters. When we talked about following God or
the
following
sons
man's
of God.
ways.
How come it's not the daughters of God who are being led off by the wily sons of man? Kind of like a greaser comes in and... No offense to anybody who's a greaser. You just have a bad reputation.
Is it just was it kind of like with Solomon being led away by
Have you
his-
not seen the movie Grease? None of them have good reputations. You shouldn't be a greaser. Okay, sorry.
Okay. But I mean, okay, so Solomon was following God, but then was led away by his wives who worshipped.
Hmm.
So maybe this was it something like that, you know, that there were these men
Yeah,
who followed, and
I
They
think
were
it's a
just led
literary device.
okay,
I
so
think
it's
it's a
not
literary
necessarily
device.
that one group was all male and one group was all female.
Hmm.
It was more like, I don't know.
Well, one thing we have to grapple with is that historically women have not been held in a very high view, just historically.
Mm.
And when you're dealing with literature, the words have meaning, and they have particular meaning in a given culture at a given time. And so if a word carries a diminutive meaning, if it has a lesser value, then you might use that to describe something that was lower in value. And so one possible explanation is, why is it sons of God and daughters of man? Well, I mean, just the physiology of the situation is that you have to have
Right.
one of each. And then the literary situation might be such that if you're going to talk about the faithful people being pulled away, well, at the time, if you notice the genealogies, it's all, this guy was the father of this guy who was the father of this guy. It follows the sons,
Mm-hmm.
because the sons were the ones who were, from a familiar perspective, important. They were the ones who sired the children. The children took their name. They were from their clan or their tribe or whatever. And so there was a sense in which all of that passed down through the fathers. And so the you don't ever see a genealogy in the Old Testament that really talks about mothers. His mother was this one,
Right.
and then he had a son, but really the mother was this one. I mean, it never traces it down through the mothers. It's always through
Mm-hmm.
the fathers. And so this idea then is one of lineage. It seems to be that these faithful people who were God's children, following the idea of a lineage, and then they get pulled away by these others who are not part of that lineage.
I see. Yeah.
And that's probably why, just from
And
a
then-
literary standpoint.
You can think too from a literary standpoint. You know, women, of course, are the very beautiful ones. So if someone's going to be pulling you away with they're very beautiful and attractive, then that would be the women they're talking about.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Could it be
not-
Exodus chapter 34, the idea of the fathers giving their daughters in marriage to the Israelites? Yes, I think it could. I think it's one of the themes that you get pulled away by women, and not that women can't ever get pulled away by men, right? But that's just one of the
But it does
the
talk
motifs.
about, like, Proverbs.
Yeah.
It talks about the
Yeah.
woman,
Listen to my words, my
Yeah.
son. Watch out for this bad
the
lady.
adulterous one.
She'll get you. Yeah, Lindsay, we've been talking some about the supernatural versus earthly, and the one of the issues with the phrase "son of God," sons of God, is that it is used to describe both fleshly and spiritual beings. And since it's used to describe both, I mean, the nation of Israel is called the sons of God, and then you have in Job chapter 1 the reference, apparently, to supernatural or spiritual beings referred to there as sons of God. It doesn't seem to be a phrase that denotes a nature.
Right.
It seems to be like spirit, an angelic being versus a human. It seems to be denoting a relationship, that one is of the Lord, whether you happen to be a human or an angelic being. And the of men seems to be denoting that they're coming from a lineage of humans, and just like an earthly focus. They're serving people and
Right.
not the Lord. And that's another motif all throughout the Bible, is who are you going to serve?
Right.
Are you going to serve mammon?
Yeah.
Are you going to serve people? If you love father, mother, brother, all that, if you love those people more than me,
Yeah.
you're not worthy of me. And so just to kind of revisit that again, the many, many people in the past have believed that this is referring to angels and humans having children. It doesn't make sense to me for a couple reasons. One, I've never seen it, but that's not a good reason not to believe something. And two, because I don't see the Nephilim as purely the byproduct of humans and angels because they show up in Numbers chapter 13 again, and they're just the children of people. And
Yeah.
so it's when I see those terms used indiscriminate of origin.
I would wonder too how you could get a physical being from spiritual and physical. Like, how would that work?
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't
How that
know.
would work.
But it's, I mean,
But-
I don't know. I don't know if it's would be related to the incarnation at all. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see, you're welcome. And thank you for joining us. I don't see any other comments about this question in particular, so we'll just go on to the next question. Kids down there, y'all have anything that you want to know about?
I have a question.
All right, what's your question? It's not about Genesis 6, is it?
In First Samuel. What?
What's your question?
In First Samuel chapter 2, verse 25, I want to know what that verse means.
What does 1 Samuel, what is it?
Chapter 2, verse 25.
Okay, so that's our question now. What does 1 Samuel 2:25 mean? So let's turn over there.
No.
What?
Yeah, it is 2:25. I thought I had the wrong verse. Sorry.
Okay, so Eli is very old,
Mhm.
and he comes to his sons. His sons are not good people. What are their names?
Hophni and Phinehas.
Good. Yeah, his sons are not good people. They're doing all kinds of terrible things. And he comes to them and he says, I do not hear a good report about you. And so this, when you hear phrases that are used, and it's a similar phrase, it should bring to mind other stories. Who else did not hear a good report about his children?
Samuel.
Who?
Samuel, eventually.
Okay, before this is happening. Who did not give a good report about his brothers?
Oh, Joseph.
Joseph, yeah. So now connect in your mind Hophni and Phinehas and Joseph's brothers. So whatever Hophni and Phinehas are doing, Joseph is telling his father that his brothers are doing stuff like that. Now, that could not be true, but we'll talk more about Joseph later. I think he may be one of the overrated people. Anyway, so here's this bad report. The father hears this bad report, and he says, it's not good that I hear this from the people of the Lord. It's spreading around. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede? So you kind of have like a court case set up. So if there's an issue between two people, God can act as the mediator, right? But if you sin against God and God is the mediator, who is there to mediate if the mediator is the one that you've harmed?
No one.
No one. Right? So basically what he's doing is he's using a picture that I think they would understand. Being priests in Israel, it was their job. You know, they're judging people, right? They judge according to the law. They're supposed to be leading the people and doing what's right, answering the people's spiritual questions, solving problems that they have. And they did a lot of mediating. And so he comes and he uses a situation they would be familiar with and says, look, all the time you're mediating between two people. And so if that's going on, then God is able to mediate there. But you now, you're not hurting another person in what you're doing. You're hurting the Lord. Who is there who are you going to get to help you out?
Yeah.
And so he seems to be saying what you're doing is very serious. You're not hurting, you're not sinning against people. You're sinning against the Lord because they were doing some bad stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's not what my question was, though.
Oh, I thought you said, what does it mean? But what's your question?
Well, that was my question, but what does the second half of that verse mean?
They would not listen to the voice.
They would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death.
For it was the will of the Lord.
Yeah, it was the will of the Lord to put them to death.
Maybe they had hardened hearts, and
Could be.
God allowed them to be hardened even more, as we saw with Pharaoh. and God let him, he chose to be hardened. So God
Yeah.
let him harden his heart even more because he made an example of him. Kind of, he said, I will show my power over Pharaoh, or something like that is the way, I don't remember how it's worded, but, or he will get glory over Pharaoh. And so maybe it's something like that.
It could be.
Maybe
Christy,
make an example.
you may not see other people's comments because this is being streamed to a few different places. And so you might actually be watching it at a different place that other people are. It's being streamed to YouTube, Periscope, and a couple different Facebook places on Facebook. So it may just be that you're seeing it from a different place to answer your question. But yeah, back to what you're saying. Pharaoh had a hard heart.
Right. And
He hardened it himself.
right.
And then along the way, God's like, fine, if that's how you're going to be,
That's what you choose. Let me harden it even more.
yeah, let's just finish the job.
Yeah.
Um,
And so if that's what they had chosen, if they chose hard hearts, maybe God allowed it to be hardened even more so that they could be made an example that others would not follow in their footsteps and would see what happened to them.
Yeah.
I don't know.
it could be. What do you think it means, Stephen? Just your reading of it.
I don't know. Could that be referring to the prophecy coming up a few verses down, that where he says that the sign to Eli will be that both his sons die in the same day?
Yeah, I mean that's what's going to happen ultimately. But when you think about what it means is, or what does it mean? You know, why does it say it the way that it does? Would it be possible? Hey, there's Deborah D. Would it be possible for God to make them obey? You have to put it on Do Not
I
Disturb.
did put on Do Not Disturb. It's still doing it. Sorry.
You just had to break your phone. Could God force them to obey?
Yeah.
Yep. Were they going to obey by themselves?
What?
Were they going to obey by themselves?
No.
It doesn't seem like it, right? Kind of like Pharaoh, when Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, hey, Pharaoh, let us go. And Pharaoh says, yeah, no. Right? Pharaoh is not going to obey by himself. He proves that repeatedly. Hophni and Phinehas, this isn't like a one-time thing. They have shown repeatedly that they really don't care much for God, or for at least the holy things of God. And it doesn't seem like they're going to obey. They're just not doing anything that God asks them to do, that God has laid out for them in the law. And God defends his holiness. How many chances did Nadab and Abihu get? One. What did God do to them? What?
And consume them with fire.
Yeah. That's a pretty dramatic example. But it was, hey, Lily, it was God defending his holiness. And so that may be factoring in here too, that you have the priests of God doing these bad things, and so God is going to judge them. Like they had their chance and they blew it. They violated the holiness of God willfully, right? It's not an accident. They didn't accidentally do these things. Everything they're doing on purpose. And so it could just be that God is, you guys are so far gone that nothing anybody says is going to bring you back. I'm not going to force you to come back. So now you're in trouble. Does that make sense? What is another thing it could mean?
I guess it could mean that God stopped them from obeying their father so that he could kill them, but that doesn't really seem to fit his character.
Right. But it could mean that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're reading through the Bible and you're trying to figure out what God is telling you, it is a very good idea to try and consider everything that a verse or that a passage might mean. So it could mean that God did not want them to repent, that God did not want them to do the right thing because God wanted to kill them. I mean, he just couldn't wait. He woke up on Tuesday and he's like, I just can't wait to kill Hophni and Phinehas. But does that sound like God? No. And so when we start looking at that, I mean, it could mean that the way the words are put together, it could have that meaning. But now when you look at those two separate explanations and you look at what everything else in the Bible says, and you have this God who is, slow to anger, whose loving kindness extends to generations, where you have God, Paul writing about God in 1 Timothy 2, that his will is for all people to obey the truth or to hear the truth and to repent, to become believers. That doesn't sound like, it wouldn't sound like you're talking about the same God, right? Or at least the same character. So, I mean, it is possible those words put together the way that they are put together, it could mean either one of those things. And so now you have to stop and take a step back and say, which one of these seems the most like God? Which one of these, and maybe a good way to do that, a good test, is to ask the question, which one of these makes sin look the worst? If these guys have no choice because God is making them sin, does that make sin look really bad?
No.
No. And so when you read through a story, kind of a good guideline is whatever makes sin look the worst, that is probably, that's a really heavy push, that's probably the best explanation. So that's how I would explain that. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
All right. Okay, I don't see any comments about that, but if you have any other questions or comments about what that might mean, feel free to leave them. Do you guys have any other questions down there? Yes, no, maybe, sometimes.
No,
Ania, what's your question?
I don't have one.
You don't have one.
I had
All right.
one, but it's very, very small.
Just turn it off.
I guess I'll have to.
All right, so now we have we have a good C.S. Lewis quote from Tim Matheny. So C.S. Lewis, kind of speaking to your question, Stephen, C.S. Lewis writes, there are only two kinds of people in the end, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. Right, and so that's a good way to kind of summarize that.
Yeah, that's what they chose.
Yeah, it's who they were, it's what they chose, and God wasn't going to stop them.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it was the Lord's will that they be put to death because he wasn't going to stop them. But
He
it was
ruled for them to choose.
Yeah, he allowed them to choose,
Right.
and they chose death for themselves. And so God said, fine, if that's what you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we have another question that comes all the way from Princeton, Texas. You guys don't know anything about that place, do you?
Oh, no,
No,
Yeah.
none.
never met anyone there.
No, don't know anybody there. So there's a couple questions actually that come from Princeton, and one of them is, what was happening with King Herod being eaten by worms? All right, so that is in Acts chapter 15. No, it's not chapter 15, it's chapter 12.
Eaten by worms.
I hope it's 12.
My favorite chapter.
That's a good
Yeah.
question.
What?
That's a good question.
It's a gross question.
Yeah, it's pretty. Guess who asked it?
I can imagine.
Yeah. It was one of your nephews.
Yeah, I figured it was a boy.
Yeah, that's a boy question. That's right. It was Hunter. Hunter, if you're with us, thank you for your question. So Hunter wanted to know, what is going on with King Herod being eaten by worms? You want to take a stab at that one?
You mean like why worms or why
What does that mean?
I guess it means what it says.
It's like Dune, like a sandworm came up.
No,
No?
I really don't know. I just assumed that it meant what it said. It was kind of like he had it inside him or something.
Yeah, I think that's what it means. Tabitha, if you're still watching, I don't know if you are, but look, it's my South Dakota cup. I think that's what it means. I don't think it means like he fell over dead, like right then, and then worms just ate him on the podium where he was speaking. I think it means that, what? They like that. I think that's their preferred interpretation downstairs. Okay, so let's read the text. It's Acts chapter 12. Herod has been not doing good things. Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. So they came down. They came to him with one accord. And having persuaded Blastus, what an awesome name, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace because their country depended on King Herod's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes. He took his seat on the throne, and he delivered a speech to them. And the people were shouting, "The voice of a god and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. So now, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No. I was just going to say, so immediately he was struck. It doesn't say necessarily that he died immediately,
Yeah.
which I never really paid attention to that. But he was struck right then with these worms and maybe sometime later died, not like at that moment died.
Yeah. Well,
although it could have been.
It could have been, right? So we're gonna play our same game. It could, what are all the ways that we could possibly understand the words as they're written? One way is that he died immediately, because it says immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down. So the question is, what does it mean to be struck down? Because he did not give God the glory, he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. So I mean, there is a sense in which it could be telling you that an angel came and did whatever, and he just fell over dead, and then worms ate him right there, which would definitely be something that people would remember.
Yeah.
Right, but anytime a king dies, people remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like, when we have had in our history, our nation's history, when presidents have been assassinated, those are like huge pivotal moments in the nation's history. People remember it.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a king to die suddenly in an unexpected way, it would be something that's memorable. And you tend to get, snapshot accounts of it. Not to get too gory or anything, but, people will say that John F. Kennedy was shot and killed. Well, I mean, not right away, and so we do the same thing with our language. We take a snapshot of an event and we tell you the whole story, even though, we focus on the critical moment,
right,
and not the hours or maybe even days afterwards. Like we'll talk about people being defeated in a battle, and we talk about that defeat as though it was a single moment in time, when really it may be a long, drawn-out event.
right.
And so probably what you're seeing here is one of those snapshot retellings. Because it could mean he fell over dead and worms just ate him right there in front of everybody. That would be really weird. It could also mean that the angel struck him and he got sick, and over the course of a few days, he died because he had worms. And that does happen. And so given those two options, I am more inclined to choose the second one, that it was something where the angel at that moment struck him, and then over the course of several days he died.
Yeah.
With worms, like maybe like a parasite or something.
Yeah, like a parasite. Something got him.
A really bad parasite.
Sir?
A really bad parasite.
Apparently worms. Yeah. All right, so let's go to the questions. Was death by this affliction meant to show that God is God? This is from Harvey. That God is God and men are men. Even though men may be worshipped as gods, they're mortal, and their bodies, no matter how gorgeously arrayed, are corruptible. No, I think you're right. I think that's the point. At the very least, that's why it shows up in our text the way that it does. Is here you have a guy who's dressed as finely as people could be dressed. Apparently he was a really good speaker.
Yeah.
And people are giving him honor, and God says, no, you're just worm food. Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah. In fact, if you like poetry, one of my what are we laughing about? One of my favorite poems. One of my favorite poems
Shouldn't have asked.
is by Edgar Allan Poe, and it's called "The Conqueror Worm."
Oh yes.
And it's got the same message,
Mm-hmm.
right? For all the gala and all the drama and everything that goes on in human life, in the end, you're worm food.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the same idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you get a chance to read that, "The Conqueror Worm" by Edgar Allan Poe. It's not in the Bible, but it's a good poem. All right, so we have another question from Princeton. And it is, yeah, go ahead, just the first part.
Okay. Do kids get a free pass to heaven?
Yeah, I guess who asked that question?
I don't want to guess.
Hunter. Hunter also.
Brother.
Hunter is the fount of all questions.
Well, that's good that he's
Yeah,
questions.
no,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That's good.
I'm glad that we get to ask him.
He's thinking.
Yes, definitely. This is where we'll stop because by the time I think we just talk about this, he actually has several questions.
I
What?
thought he was losing it again.
Oh, that's quite common. So Hunter has several questions. Do kids get a free pass to heaven? How does all of that work? And is there an age when I'm not a kid anymore? And so we don't have time to answer all of his questions, so we'll kind of pick up with those next time. We'll just do the first one right now. Do kids get a free pass to heaven? Well, I might word it differently. The answer to that question, from my perspective, would be a yes. And it's not that they're kids, it's that they're innocent. And God, having made everything, God makes things good. And yes, sin has come into the world, and sin has corrupted creation. The world that we live in is not the world that God originally created. We do not live in the Garden of Eden anymore. We do not have the same kind of relationship with God where Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God. Things have changed because sin has come into the world. And Jesus comes into the world, and Jesus is restoring all things. Right? The apostles in their preaching, they will talk about the time for restoring all things. And I think it's looking back to that garden. Christ is fixing everything. That's why he came, is to fix everything that sin broke. And so while sin is in the world today, we suffer, we die, one day that won't be the case. One day all that stuff, everything will be put back the way it was supposed to be. Jesus has come to do that. And when we think about how we live in a world that is affected by sin, sometimes it's still hard to see. Sometimes it's just hard to see or to even think of a time where everything worked the way it was supposed to. And there is a sense in which God, looking down at his creation, and this is how I would just explain it very broadly, looking down at his creation, us in this broken world, God does not hold us accountable for things that we cannot know and cannot understand. And a good example of that would be with Zechariah and Mary. Before I get into my example, Harvey commented that Jesus would say that unless you become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Mm-hmm. And he'll say to such belongs the kingdom of heaven, right. Even talking about children. Yes, I mean, he highlights them as these who have a particular special relationship with the Lord. I don't think that children are born lost. I think that they're born right. They don't know enough to separate themselves from the Lord. And so it's something that will happen throughout their, over time. And so when we think about what it means from the passage that Harvey quoted, and when he says you have to be like the children, well, we have to kind of get back to that same state, that same kind of relationship with the Lord. And so when we think about what we're trying to do, when we come to follow Christ and we're redeemed, we're put back like we were before, where now we had become lost. We'd lost our way. Jesus finds us and brings us back. And so that's the sense in which kids get a free pass, right? They haven't lost their way yet. And so they don't have anything to be saved from because they haven't yet been lost. And if you haven't been lost, then you're still safe. And if you're safe, you don't need to be saved.
So would you say that the time when you are lost is when you suddenly know that you are?
Well, I would, it depends. It depends. Because then people say, well, can you be lost? And it depends. And so that's a much more difficult conversation to have. But when instead of thinking of saved or lost, if we would use my children, some people's kids,
retention.
If we would think in terms of safe and danger, that might be a better way to think of it. Children are not in danger. They're born with the Lord. They're with the Lord. There's no danger there. But there will come a time when they wander away, and now they're in danger. And if they don't come back, they won't be safe again. And so maybe those two words are a better way to understand it. Mm-hmm. Children are safe. They're not in danger. And so that's kind of how I would explain it. Just as a very simple introduction to that topic. What do you guys downstairs think? Does that sound good?
I had a question about that.
Okay.
You said God does not. You said God does not hold people responsible for what they cannot help, or not. I mean, what they cannot know.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So that brings my question: is that why God don't? Yeah. Is that why God did not punish the Philistines when they sent back the ark on the cart? Because they would have had to touch it, whereas any Israelite who touched it died.
Yes, I think that's part of it. Her impression. Yeah, I think that's part of it. That they just don't know. The example, to go back to the example that I was going to use, is of Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, and Mary. An angel appears to Zechariah and says, "Hey, you're going to have a kid." And Zechariah says, "I don't believe you," and he gets punished. Right? The angel says, "You don't get to talk." An angel shows up to Mary and says, "Hey, you're going to have a baby." And in almost the exact same words, she says, "I don't know about that." But
Says, how can this be?
right. And
She
but
didn't say
that's
she didn't believe it. She's like,
right.
how is this working?
Same words that Zechariah said.
Yeah.
How can this be? One should have known better. And the other, if she's a younger woman, I don't know that we could expect her to know better. Like when the priest is in the temple offering incense, and an angel shows up and says, "God said this." You as the priest go, "Okay." You don't say, "What? It can't be right." But now if you're a young girl and you've never had experience in the temple, you've never spent much time reading or studying the scriptures, you may have heard them read, but women typically, my understanding is, didn't spend a lot of time reading the scriptures. It was other people's job to kind of do that and lead them and guide them, at that time at least. And so all of a sudden, when an angel appears to you and says this outrageous thing, you might go, "What? How? Wait, I don't get this." And it's not the same kind of circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So one person, Mary, the angel is patient and explains to her. The angel explains to Zechariah too, but I mean, he explains to her, and when she hears the explanation, her response is, "May it be done as you have said." Okay. I may not understand how that's going to happen, but you said it is. That's good for me. And then Zechariah seems to be held to a much higher standard because he was a priest.
Yeah.
And when the angel told him, "You're going to have a child," Zechariah should have said, "That sounds great. I believe you because God said it." And so that's kind of what we see. What do y'all think?
That makes sense.
Is this the end of our time?
Yep, that's it. All right, so we'll pick up, Hunter, with the rest of your question. We'll look at how does all that work, and is there a particular age? I don't. We might spend a lot of time talking about that next time. Thanks, Hunter, for making my life difficult. Thank you for joining us. We're going to do this again every Friday at 7. God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you next week.